Our, our first panel this morning is titled Wilderness Reflections from the Front Lines. It will be moderated by my fellow Frank Church staff member and former Congressman Larry LaRocco. As a member of the House Committee on Interior, Larry sponsored the Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Act, the Lower Salmon Recreation and Scenic Rivers Act, and the Idaho Wilderness Sustainable Forests and Communities Act. Although Larry did not resolve all of Idaho's wilderness areas, I know it was not for the lack of trying in Congress, because I was his chief of staff. Larry LaRocco.
Thank you, Gary. It's my great pleasure to be with you today to moderate this great panel. This is going to be an outstanding 90 minutes, guaranteed, because we have before you, I don't know, I've done sort of a casual count, but over 150 years of frontline conservation activism. And so we are going to hear from some people who have been there. I won't need to stand at this podium and moderate the barbs going back and forth, because this is they are all conservation advocates. There is nobody here advocating for the Sagebrush Rebellion or the Wise Use Movement. I can guarantee that. It was my great pleasure to work for Senator Church for 6 years. I got embroiled in a couple of interesting and very visionary projects with Senator Church. One was the River of No Return Wilderness that we've been discussing. I was on the floor of the Senate with him on the day that we passed it. He passed it through the United States Senate. I remember looking up in the gallery and seeing Doug Scott up there cheering when we had the great vote. I was on the ground moderating or mediating the Gospel Hump Wilderness for Senator Church that we passed, and I helped with the St. Joe River compromise that was done in his final years as well. So Senator Church was my mentor, and I represented him in the northern counties of Idaho. And if you know that the north from Salmon River north, you know that there are controversies in that particular part of the world, many national forests, many roadless lands, and many issues to address. I was lucky enough to serve in Congress, and as Gary mentioned, I served on the Interior Committee. And right after I got to Congress, I was walking through the halls and I saw this great saying that was up on the ceiling, and it was mentioned in Doug Brinkley's book, Wilderness Warrior. And the saying said, "The nation behaves well when it treats its natural resources as assets to be transferred and to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value." I immediately had the Capitol photographer go over and take a picture of that. I had it framed and it hung in my office as a constant reminder of what we were there to do, not only as a member of the Interior Committee, but as a member of Congress. Because our time in Congress is not governed by any particular law. We have to stand for re-election, and you have to make the most of the time that you have there. And it was my intent to do the best I could for the natural resources of Idaho. Dick Gebhardt once told me when I was a freshman congressman, he said, "Do right, risk consequences." And certainly that is the, I think, philosophy of Senator Church. When we just think of the possibility of him not taking up the River of No Return Wilderness in his latter years of service to the state, and maybe sort of making that comfortable decision that, well, I have a tough election coming up, I can't take on this controversy now, we'll just wait until after 1980. And thank God Senator Church took on that challenge and passed the bill and then stood for re-election and stood and faced the consequences of that, which were not positive for the state of Idaho because he lost. We have before us panelists that have been on the front lines. There's sort of a thought that maybe wilderness legislation, you propose it, you introduce it in committee, and then you have hearings on it, and then it automatically passes. This is about politics. This has nothing to do with executive orders or administrative actions. This is about passing a piece of legislation that is not easy to do. I remember when we were explaining to the Idaho County in the Elks Club in Grangeville about the Gospel Hump Wilderness, that Frank Church was hanging in effigy on a flatbed truck outside the Elks Club. It was controversial. I remember Bethine Church telling me about a hearing that they had in Salmon one time where one of the adversaries of the wilderness bill rode into the courthouse on a horse to make his point. A reporter, just like Rocky Barker, who's here today, asked Bethine, "What did you think of that?" And she said, "That's a good-looking horse." And they stood the pressure of the anti-wilderness factions in Idaho, and there are many. So today we have the frontline activists. What I'd like to do for the first hour or so today is to have a discussion, and it will be prompted mainly, I think, by their comments. I will moderate and try and prompt it and take it along. I want to open up the mics in the last half hour, looking at the interest that you had when we had the chief speaking. I assume that there will be more interest to ask these people. So what I'm going to ask the panelists to do, I'm going to sit down, but I'm going to ask them to go in descending order here for just a couple of minutes to tell a little bit of their story. And I just need this to be short, panelists, not long, okay, because we'll get into stuff. But I would like them to tell us what issue, what person, or what event propelled them into activism for conservation. Why did they choose conservation activism instead of any other pursuit? And what was it that really led them to where they are today? So Doug, the microphones are open here. You can use that one or you can come up here. Let's make this short so that we can move on to other discussions. Scaring me.
Larry and I are very old friends, and what he didn't mention are two things about the experience with the Gospel Hump Wilderness, the negotiations that led to the designation of that area. It was a negotiated deal. We had won some, or were going to win, some administrative appeals back when Tom's administrative appeal mechanism was very appellant friendly. And so this panicked my friends in the Chamber of Commerce, and four of them asked Senator Church to see if he could get 4 wilderness leaders to come to Grangeville and meet at the Elks Club. And Senator Church called me, and he called the 3 others who were Idahoans. I think he called me because I was a troublemaker. And we met with Frank and Bethine, she didn't go roll bandages with the rest and pour tea with the rest of the Senate wives. She was an absolute working partner in almost every meeting I ever attended with Frank, including in that hotel room, and he had his god-awful stogie, and she said, "Frank, put that out." And the 4 of us, the 4 of us who were the enviros were so nervous that we stopped. Senator Church or the sheriff had arranged to have undercover officers present because things were hot in Grangeville, and the 4 of us stopped to pee just outside of town, and we weren't doing that because we were nervous. We were doing that because we wanted to mark our escape route. I'm so glad to see all of you, but I'm more than most, I'm glad to see you high schoolers over here because you're the future. We count on you in all the things, most notably the subject that Tom talked about, the grave concern about the future of our planet and our ice and our oceans and the polar bears and so forth. Well, I'm to run through wilderness history really quickly, and here we go. Lewis and Clark, the mountain men, and others wrote of their enthusiasm for the beauties of the West that they encountered as they explored and trapped. Far-sighted people led the way to the establishment of the world's first national park, Yellowstone, in 1892. And they didn't just do a little bit of small areas around the geysers and the mud pots and the great Yellowstone Falls. They made it 2 million acres big, wild country. The setting, the vital setting, like a diamond ring for the great wonders of that first national park, the first in the world. In 1924, Aldo Leopold secured the establishment of the Gila Wilderness Area, the world's first real wilderness area with real boundaries, defended by an administrative order signed by a regional official in Albuquerque. But these, and those for the 71 additional administratively established wilderness areas that came into existence by 1940, were established by the stroke of a pen, and they could be unestablished by the stroke of the same pen. And that was the fatal flaw. And I'm not making this up, it really happened. Anytime someone lusted after a mineral or a stand of old-growth trees, out it came by the stroke of a pen. And to the wilderness ringleaders of that time, and there were 12 of them, not many more than that, this was simply unacceptable. Their commitment was to preserving wilderness in perpetuity. And so the idea that this was going to be a slowly dwindling history was just unacceptable. And that and some other things, going back into the writings of Bob Marshall and others in the 20s and 30s, and Aldo Leopold first of all, this began the drive to conceive of, draft, and enact the Wilderness Act of 1964. Now, that was a very dumb, bold thing to even dream of doing in the politics of the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. I was just a youngkin then. I think I was 3, in 1947, when the idea was actually formally begun. And, but I was very politically active. And I remember very clearly that this was not, Larry, a period of robust and vigorous political action in our country for nature protection and wilderness and parks. So what courage it took, what boldness to go down this avenue propelled by the belief that wilderness areas should be preserved in perpetuity, and not just for us and our children and our children's children, but for the salmon and the snapdragon, the paintbrush, we'll get there, and the grizzlies and those wolves that Tom talked about in the Frank. Vital in perpetuity. And there was the fuel that fired the engine for the campaign for the Wilderness Act. In those first years, despite the fact that the draftsman of the Wilderness Act and the man who conceived it, Howard Zahniser, the executive director of the Wilderness Society based in Washington, D.C., had written provisions that made exceptions to allow livestock grazing, within 25 years, mining and gouging and drilling and pumping, and all those other good things. There was widespread opposition. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce got a leaked copy of the draft bill and issued a press release opposing it before there was a bill. It's an unusual way. Typically you wait. I mean, it just seems reasonable. So the conservation groups just had to cinch up their belts and get on with it. I'm using every metaphor in overusing every metaphor there ever was. The issue that held up the Wilderness Bill, because it was introduced in the spring of 1956, and Tom and everyone else, it was bipartisan. And that's an important part of wilderness politics. It was a bipartisan bill from the get-go, a liberal's liberal in the Senate and a deep-dyed conservative in the House, who was a very good friend of mine. And they just went to work. They were the perfect team, and it took, nonetheless, it took 4 years, because in the first 4 years, the dark ages of the Eisenhower administration, you know, he was a beloved grandfather, but what are you going to do? The Forest Service and the chief and top leaders and the director in particular of the National Park Service opposed it with everything they had. The election of John Kennedy, who came to the Oval Office in 1961, changed everything, because he appointed Orville Freeman and Stuart Udall, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of the Interior, and he said, go over there and knock some heads together. And he said to Udall, you're the chief lobbyist, I want this bill and I want it now. And Udall, who was of course a great former member of the House and a great conservationist, went right at it. The bill passed the Senate the first time in 1961. It passed the House, the Senate, the House didn't have any interest in it, and so it had to go back again in 1963. In 1961, as Larry mentioned, the senator from New Mexico who was in charge of the bill, because he was the committee chairman and its chief sponsor, had to return to Albuquerque for surgery. And so he asked Frank, who was the subcommittee chairman and had chaired all the hearings in the Senate on the wilderness bill, to step forward and manage the bill. And Frank said he would. Frank's father-in-law, the former governor of Idaho, called him up and said, because Frank was facing re-election in 1962, his first re-election, and he was very liberal, not just by Idaho standards, but in general. And he said to his father-in-law, Pop, I've got this hosed. I know every word in this law. I've heard every moment of Senate testimony. I can defend this law to anyone in the state of Idaho, and I will. And he did, and he won going away. Same thing happened, because it didn't get through the House that year. Same thing happened again early in 1963, and again, by an overwhelming margin. When he opened the debate, so he was asked again, because he'd done such a marvelous job, and when he opened the debate in '63, he said, the opponents of the Wilderness Bill charge that its object is to create vast playgrounds in the West for rich Easterners. What poppycock! I would think that the business any vacationer brings to the West is welcome from whatever part of the country he may come. I'm thankful that many do come to Idaho from afar to witness the unique attractions of our primitive areas. But the fact remains that most of the hikers, hunters, and fishermen who enjoy the wildlands of my state come from the farms and towns of Idaho itself. As for the rest, the big majority are Westerners from neighboring states. And every senator voting to report this bill favorably to the Senate represents a state that is west of the Mississippi River. We will have preserved, for now and for generations to come, unborn, areas of unspoiled wilderness, accessible by a system of trails, unmarred by roads or buildings, but open to use and enjoyment by hikers, mountain climbers, fishermen, trail riders, and all those who find in the high and lonely placements a refreshment of the spirit and life's closest communion with God. It is a great spiritual experience. I never knew a man who took a bedroll into an Idaho mountainside and slept there under the star-studded summer sky, who felt self-important the next morning. Unless we preserve some opportunity for future generations to have the same experience, we shall have dishonored our trust to prosperity. Widespread support from Republicans, from the Republican as well as the Democratic side of the aisle, was a key feature, he told the Senate. In 1977, I think you must have written this, Larry, or maybe I did, the wilderness movement was not a romantic excursion into the past. Rather, it was the start of our future. As we rise to the difficult challenge of designating wilderness and managing our natural resources, the land, the air, the water, the meaning of wilderness will open our eyes like an Idaho sunrise on a summer morning. There he talks about wilderness stewardship. Don't use the word wilderness management. And whatever you do, don't use the word that Congress creates wilderness areas. I'm not quite clear on who creates them and the elk, but I know who doesn't. So words matter, and my congressional friends know that very well. This history is important because we have work to do, and the lessons of how this ragged band of wilderness folks rounded up congressional champions and persisted to get these areas protected by law, by statutory law, because that was the solution. These areas did not end up having to be subject to that same slashing back of the boundaries whenever some administrator wanted to do that by signing with the stroke of a pen. They'll strip it away. There's 7 sections, or it used to be 7 sections in the Wilderness Act. Strip it all down. It's about making the boundary lines stay put. It took me a long time to figure out how to say that. That's what it's about. Congress says it takes an act of Congress to designate a wilderness area. It takes an act of Congress to remove an area from the boundary. It's happened about a dozen times. One time in Vermont, it was a guy's farm and house and outbuildings. He wasn't too pleased. That was 2,700 acres. All the other times have been tiny, half an acre or 32 acres or things like that. And it's practical issues where a dirt road servicing a power line, inadvertently, it was just a mistake, and everybody agreed, and the boundary line kept cutting off the access to that area. And rather than fool around relocating that dirt road, Congress just quickly, and our movement supported it, or it wouldn't have happened. It's easy to kill bills, right? My friend Rick and I have done that more than once, and Frank did it many times. And that's why the designation of wilderness by statutory law. It's harder than hell to pass the statute through Congress. But the secret is that once you do, the worm turns. Shoes on the other foot. You hand the spear to someone else. What else? And then they have the burden of passing a law to make that change. And if you don't like that change, it's not going to happen. Count on it. So, learn from this history. The BLM joined the wilderness program in 1976. Now there's vast areas of BLM and National Forest and National Park Service land under study and under interim protection here in Idaho. The biggest, I think, is the Gates of the, no, that's wrong, Craters of the Moon National Monument over by Atomic City. What's the name of that place? Arco. But they have a big sign there that says Atomic City. Today, wilderness activists are on the ground anywhere. It didn't used to be that way. Every small town in Idaho, my favorite place is Grangeville. You don't have to pee on the way in. McCall, Pocatello, any place there's a college, you're home free. There's wilderness activists on the ground.
Doug, could you wrap up?
Yep. And it shows 758 wilderness areas, 110 million acres big, 5% of the landmass of the United States, and this year the Congress is going to pass another 2 million plus. Take that to the bank. Bipartisan bills. So, there it is, the history of a vibrant and powerful and growing wilderness movement. And we must learn from that history, because it would be sad if the activists wasted their time reinventing the wheel. So, learn from this history and get to work.
Thank you, Doug. Now I invite Rick Johnson for his opening remarks, and Rick is the Executive Director of the Idaho Conservation League and veteran of many, many conservation battles. Rick?
Thanks very much. I'll use the podium in part because when I'm sitting here I can't see those folks, and I figure it's the reverse. Larry asked us to start a little bit with the journey, and for me the journey started with catching my first trout in the White Clouds. My first night that I spent in the boulders, the first time that I saw a mountain goat at elevation, the first time I heard the bugle of an elk, the first time that I really felt that tingling that I can pull up right now when I saw my first grizzly bear. The first time I heard the sound of a coyote in the Wahi Canyonlands, or the first time that I stepped to Bruneau Canyon. The very first time I ever went there, I walked up to the rim and a golden eagle just leapt off in front of me. Before I'd even seen the canyon, I saw the eagle dive and rise up. And that's where, for everybody that's a wilderness advocate, for everybody that loves this, and for my opinion, anybody that loves Idaho, it starts with these special places. It starts with that little tingle. It starts with the line about that Frank Church talks about, how you don't ever wake up self-important the next morning. But what also comes as a wilderness advocate is an understanding of the vulnerability of these places. You watch places disappear. You watch logging roads get built, or mines get built, or motorized recreation begin sort of the death of 1,000 cuts that very slowly but very completely reduces the integrity of this kind of landscape. And it was that vulnerability, beginning to understand that vulnerability, that led me into starting to go to a couple meetings, starting to get on the Forest Service EIS list, starting to poke around at what it became to be a conservation advocate. But it was really 30 years ago. This is the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, but I have to say it's the 30th anniversary that Craig Yerke and I have worked together, starting as volunteers and moving into staff work to do this work. 30 years ago, I was invited back to Washington, D.C., and it was in a meeting in the old Sierra Club office on Pennsylvania Avenue after a week of being a wilderness advocate in what they called the Alaska Room, the room that Doug Scott and many others had helped orchestrate, the Alaska Lands Act, that I realized that people do this for a living. This can be a career. This is not just something you do around the kitchen table after work. And as a guy who was pounding nails and hanging sheetrock, I was kind of looking for an alternative. And I realized I had found it. But one of the things that made that happen in that trip to DC 30 years ago is I also realized that instead of just being about special places, this was about special people. That this was a movement of people. And I look around this room and I see a whole lot of people that know more about this than me. And one of the things I realized is I heard the stories in Washington, D.C., the stuff that Doug can, that comes out of his pores, the war stories and the legends and the history of how this all happened, that it's all about people. It started with places, it started with that sunset, but it's about people. And the key thing for me are the mentors that really gave me the time. Doug Scott is one of those people, but there are many others. The people that really taught me this art, the art of conservation, the art of wilderness advocacy. Fast forward a bunch of years and we're working on the Boulder White Clouds as legislation, and you get caught up in the pieces of the bill. This is a copy of all the front pages of all the various bills that Mike Simpson has introduced in Congress to protect the Boulder White Clouds. In the beginning of that process, we were beginning a very rigorous discussion of compromise, working with different interests, working with a Republican member of Congress. And I knew that we were going to get a little heat for it. I mean, I started this whole game a little left of center, I'd be the first to admit. C. Sanders likes to talk about how, you should have seen him, he had hair down to here. well, I can't grow hair down to here anymore, but I used to have it. I incidentally cut it off at the Boise airport when I was flying to DC for my very first trip. Cut my ponytail off with a Swiss Army knife. But anyway, when we were doing that work with Mike Simpson in the very beginning, I knew we were going to get a lot of heat. So I went to see Bethune Church. And I figured, you know, the grand dame of wilderness politics, the grand dame of democratic politics is going to have something to say about this. So I went over to her old townhouse on Walnut and got a little audience and sat down, and I started talking about what we were doing with Mike Simpson. She's like, really, Mike Simpson? And I go, yeah. And I said, this is what we're going to try to do, and it's going to be compromised. There's going to be these different parts of the bill, and it's going to be hard, and there's going to be some people that get mad at us and all this other stuff. And I'm thinking, you're one of them. And so she folded her arms and leaned forward, gave me that look that she could do. But in that look, I also saw the twinkle that was clearly the personification of Bethune Church. And I just want to recognize, again, this is the first one of these conferences where she has not attended. But anyway, Bethune leaned forward. She unfurled her arms and she stuck her finger out and she says, I have one thing to say to you, Rick Johnson. I'm very disappointed. Then she held on. I'm very disappointed that it took you this long to figure this out. But anyway, wilderness is about compromise. It's about getting together. It's cutting the deal. It's making the political arrangement, because the miracle of wilderness is that it only happens if someone passes a law, that Congress passes a law. It's typically done by the home state congressional delegation, so people like me have to go to the Idaho congressional delegation with a backup of people like you. I am nothing without you. Our organizations are nothing without you. The Idaho Conservation, the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, all these different organizations, it's all about people. And we show up and we have to pass a law with a home state delegation. We have to get a majority vote. That requires we talk to county commissions, chambers of commerce, all these different interests, and we have to stitch it all together and move something forward. And it is a collaborative process. It has always been a collaborative process. And I'm a true believer in it. It took me all this gray hair to get it, but I am a believer in the process of compromise. I'm becoming a bit cynical on the process of collaboration, however. We have been counseled and we have been sat down at endless meetings, endlessly attended, where we're sitting down and trying to work out various agreements. This represents 12 years of bills in Congress for Mike Simpson to pass a bill, and I'm excited that he is interested in going back and doing it again. But I got to tell you, I'm cynical about it. And for that reason, I'm still a strong advocate for executive action, because I don't think Congress works right now. So my position is that the Boulder White Clouds needs to be protected by the President through the Antiquities Act. But in the end, the protection of wilderness, the protection of all these things, it's about special places. It's the places that make our hearts sing, the places that make us get up and just sit in a almost windowless room and talk about these special places on a Monday morning. But it's really about special places, but the key thing, the key lesson for me is that special people are what the movement's about. I got into it because of the White Clouds, but I stay into it because of the people that love the White Clouds. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rick. You touched on a number of different points that I hope we can explore in terms of the vulnerability and the politics, and that it's not necessarily a top-down operation. It takes a lot of collaboration and hard work. And one of the hardest working conservation advocates is to my right, and our next speaker. You have his resume in front of you in the program, but Craig Gerke is a good friend of mine, and we've worked together on a lot of things. And he grew up in Cottonwood and understands central Idaho and Idaho very well, and Idaho politics. Craig, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'm going to back up a minute just to give a bit of perspective, since Grangeville's come up a couple times here. I actually grew up very close to Grangeville. My great-grandfather homesteaded on the Nez Perce Reservation as soon as it was open to homesteading in 1888. So my family has a long history in Idaho here, and I grew up very close to the original ranch. Very rural setting. We were at the end of the mail route, into the bus route, into the phone line, into the electrical line, and I grew up seeing on a pretty daily basis elk, deer, coyotes, nature. That transition from the forest of Craig Mountain to the Camas Prairie was a very special place. And that's where I got a lot of my desire to want to protect nature, I guess. And as long as I can remember, I grew up wanting to be a forest ranger. I didn't know what a forest ranger really did, but it sounded kind of cool. So I went to the University of Idaho and got my degree and started working in the Forest Service and found out what a forest ranger did, at least in the late 1970s, and it sure as hell wasn't wilderness protection. So that was kind of a wake-up call after this degree in hand and wanting to be a forest ranger and seeing these conservation groups over here doing what I thought I would be doing as the forest ranger, of protecting wildlife and protecting wilderness and all this kind of stuff. Didn't look like it was going to happen. So I went back to the University of Idaho and thought, well, I'll do something else. And there was this petition in Book People, the bookstore in Moscow, that was a petition to sign for a designation of the Boulder White Clouds as wilderness. This was in 1980, I think. And so that was the first conservation act I ever took, was signed this petition. And like any good organization, ICL took that name and followed me down to my apartment where it was and sunk their teeth into me. The other thing that also happened, I'm going to embarrass him a little bit because he's here today. I was taking communication courses, and we had a person come talk to one of our classes there. And it was Dennis Baird. And Dennis Baird was one of the pioneers in conservation. And Dennis came in and gave a talk. He did one side about wilderness, and the other guy was Todd Maddock from Potlatch. And Dennis basically, wiped the floor with this guy. And Dennis inspired me because he was so smart and so articulate and so well-versed in the issues of wilderness that Dennis inspired me. I'm always going to thank him for that. And at the same time, he was writing the Palouse chapter newsletter of the Sierra Club. And you talk about an in-your-face, right to the core of the issue publication. It was a hoot to read. I've still saved many copies of my files of the Palouse chapter of the Sierra Club's newsletter that talked about timber sales, talked about all kinds of issues. And so that was an inspiration. Other people, Mort Brigham in Lewiston. I would stop and see Mort up in Lewiston Orchards, driving back and forth to my folks' ranch, and just listen to Mort's stories. And then moved to Boise and met Ernie Day, who did so much. Met Jerry Jane finally, met Ralph finally. The folks who really set the stage for people like Rick and I. They framed the wilderness debate in Idaho. And the fact that we even have wilderness in Idaho, it can't be overemphasized that it was a citizen-led movement from the get-go. It's always been about places. For the young people here, I think the best way to think about a wilderness protection is to think of it as a never-ending presidential campaign, where you are promoting a place and not a person. And occasionally you drag it across the finish line, and then you gear up and you run somebody else. The point I'd like to make here that continues to inspire me is that the Forest Service does all kinds of recommendations for wilderness. The BLM does it. We have all kinds of laws and policies. It comes down to people loving a place. We don't have dams in Hell's Canyon right now, not because the government much gave a damn, but because people did not want to see it dammed up. We now have the Selway Bitterroot. We don't have clear cuts on each side of the Magruder Corridor, not because the Forest Service didn't try very hard to make that happen, but because people like Mort Brigham, Doris Milner in Hamilton, Montana, chewed the hamstrings off the Forest Service for years to keep them from logging that place. And one of the most ironic things I've ever seen was about 3 years ago, Jerry Jane, Dennis, and I went to this dedication on the Idaho-Montana border where the Forest Service put up a plaque honoring Doris Milner for her work to save the Selway country. Unbelievable. So my point is that people want to know how does conservation work? Conservation works when people love a place, where they get together and talk to other people that love this place, and they start arguing for its protection. The laws and the hearings, it's all necessary. The science is very necessary. It comes down to passion, and it comes down to people who know a spot in Idaho or any place in the country, and they want to see it kept the way it is now. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about tearing roads up or kicking people off the land. We're talking about these few pieces in this country that have not been developed. And we want to make the commitment for the highest standard of protection, which, you know, I'm with the Wilderness Society. That means wilderness. It's a commitment to the future. We have built so much in this state on the work of the folks I just mentioned and countless others who organize themselves. There's no game book that tells you how to be a successful conservationist. You know, you just get together and you pull a lot of different levers. But it comes down to talking to people that love your place. And you also have to talk to a lot of people who don't like you. That's part of the downside of this. But that's okay, because it's worth it in the end. I get to spend a fair amount of time on my off hours enjoying Hell's Canyon, Sawtooth, the Frank Church Wilderness. Every time I go there, I think about, wow, the folks who came before me set the debate here for us. And the work that Rick and I did on the Owahis, the work that we're trying to do on the White Clouds, would not have been possible without the decades of work, starting back with the Wilderness Act, but then also starting back with the old primitive area concept and the work with people like Frank Church to say that there are places in the state that we take on their own terms. We're not going to take anything from them, but we're going to share them with the folks that come after us.
Thank you, Craig. Our last panelist to address the conference, and then we'll get into an open-ended discussion, is Dr. Ralph Maughan, Professor Emeritus from Idaho State University, who's been very involved in that part of the world in eastern Idaho, but in Idaho in general with the Sierra Club and the Yellowstone Coalition. And so Dr. Maughan, please take the podium. The floor is yours, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Larry. Good speaker. Speaking of the hearing in Salmon City, the raucous hearing back in 1979, I just wrote a short book about that. It was published last month, published in the form of a download at Amazon. Some of you might be interested in that. Larry asked us to talk about the things which, or the one event or the things that inspired us to get active in wilderness conservation and related matters. One of my first memories, strong memories, was when I was 3 years old. Now, my family, the Maughans, settled Cache Valley, Utah, beginning in 1859, and many of us remained there. And when I was 3 years old, and about that time, my father was working in my grandfather's prospect up on the mountains behind Hiram, Utah. And before they built a road up there, he'd carry me up on his back every morning, and they'd put me out in the sagebrush and let me play. It gave me a pretty early experience to the undeveloped country. But I remember looking out over southern Cache Valley and thinking, what a beautiful world this is. Those weren't my words. I didn't have really words at that time, but it's a feeling that I remember. What a beautiful world this is, and how new everything is, and that feeling always stayed with me. Jumping ahead quite a while, I left Utah and Idaho. We also lived in Rexburg for a while, and I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. And I left with the idea that I wasn't going to come back to Utah or Idaho because the opportunities seemed to be few, the economy was stagnant, and really the people that I grew up with were not particularly interested in the things that I was interested in. And I started to miss the mountains, however, after Wisconsin, in many ways, a great state, but I began to miss the mountains. And then in 1970, there was a very important experience, and that was the first Earth Day. We went out into a spit that went out into Lake Mendota, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, and had kind of a first Earth Day celebration. And I was so thrilled to find out there were people who felt about the Earth the same way that I did. I didn't know there were, and I felt like I'd found my compatriots. Well, I had. So when I got my doctor's degree in political science, I got a job at Idaho State University, and I'd already read up about the issues in Idaho which were causing controversy. The Teton Dam in particular, the proposed mine on the site of Castle Peak in the White Cloud Mountains. Now, I lived in Rexburg, and I knew what a beautiful canyon the Teton Canyon was, and I found the Sierra Club quite rapidly in Pocatello, and soon I became the leader of it. I found some other people in Pocatello who agreed with me, Dr. John Merriam, who Merriam Peak is named after now, and Ron Waters, who's published many outdoor books. And one night we went up to Idaho Falls and we found our friends there, Jerry Jane, Russ Brown, Dick Farman, Carl Hocevar, Joe Feely, and we really formed a group that worked on these issues. With the Teton Dam, I learned that not only was there emotion on our side, economics was on our side. It was a terrible project. And not only that, of course, it collapsed and drowned people and ended up costing about $1 billion. The River of No Return Wilderness was not one isolated thing in my life, which I did, and then all of a sudden I found myself up here. From the start, I wanted to be engaged in these issues, and the River of No Return Wilderness was one of them that was on the plate. We could see it coming up, but about the same time, there were many other things taking place. Rare 1 and Rare 2, the roadless areas of Idaho were as attractive to me almost as the wilderness areas. The problem with them was, as Doug Scott said, the boundaries were not fixed, and I wanted to make those fixed. So that's how I got involved in these things and the importance of the experience of Earth Day. And I've continued on throughout my life. I'm 69 years old now, and I plan to continue as long as I can. Thank you.
Well, now I'd like to get this panel talking a little bit among itself about some of the issues that have been brought up by each of them. I really like what you said, Rick, about special places and special people, because you see the champions that not only passes through Congress, but the Ernie Days and the Ted Truebloods and the Mort Brighams and the Pat Fords of the conservation movement that have been icons and have pushed the champions and the legislators forward. And the Sierra Club, as I know it, you've got the people on the ground that identify the areas, they know the values, they know the importance of it, and they have the information that they can take and make the arguments for protection. So the question is, and Ralph just brought this up about Rare 2, Rare 1, roadless areas. After Senator Church passed the River of No Return Wilderness, there were still 9 million acres of roadless lands in Idaho that had no designation on them but had no roads. So where did we go from there? I did my part to try and identify some lands and propose them for wilderness. And Andrus and McClure came up with their bipartisan solution, and it didn't work. But the point here that we've talked about is that this sometimes takes decades. These gentlemen have spent most of their lives working on these areas, not for instant gratification or instant accomplishment, but spending time laying the work, the groundwork for the eventual protection of these areas in one way or another, whether it be by legislation or by the Antiquities Act or by executive order. It doesn't matter in some ways, but they have set the stage for us, and it doesn't happen overnight. So sort of the question that I throw out is, are there any champions anymore for you to work with in Congress? Are the Frank Churches and the Cyberlings and the Mo Udalls all gone? Is everybody just afraid of this issue? Does the environment lend itself to the type of work that you do? And the point was made that these are acts of Congress. What does Congress do all the time? They amend acts of Congress. Are these bills and these the number of wilderness areas that the chief mentioned, are they in danger from amendment, from a political environment that could tilt towards the right, and or from some pro-development issue? We hear all the time about, state land, the states taking over the management of the lands. What does this mean? So those are a couple of thoughts. I'm just going to open it up to anybody that wants to lean into their microphone and talk about those issues. But Rick, we've got 9 million acres of roadless lands. We had a roadless lands program that was started by a few people here. Is it over? I'm sure the chief would like to hear your answer, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think that the real challenge that began back with that 9 million acres is we had this period of time of great accomplishment in the wilderness movement. With Wild Rivers and Wilderness, we passed bills for the state of Idaho, led by Frank Church all the way in 1964, 1968, 1970, 1972, 1978, 1975, I skipped, and then finally 1980. That's a whole lot of success. I think it's important to point out that on National Forests of Idaho, we have not passed a bill since. The Owyhee Canyonlands bill was a huge achievement in 2009. It was on BLM, and it was a different process, different scenario. But in the National Forest, we still have so much distance to go. And I think the really big thing that happened is some young, then young pups like us came into this movement right after the Frank Church bill had passed. And it was soon to be right after Frank himself passed away. And there was a change. It was the Reagan years. It was a change of politics. And our response was to find champions elsewhere. We didn't look for champions within Idaho. We looked for champions outside of Idaho. Peter Kosmeier, Jim Moody, some other members of Congress, and some of us thought that was just the way to get it done, that we would roll the Idaho delegation. And when that didn't work, we figured the best way to do that would be make our bill bigger. And to have every time Craig and I would be a part of some meeting, our proposal would grow by another several 100,000, if not millions of acres. And we would get more and more people, and we just got bigger and bigger, and we got more and more politically irrelevant. We slipped off the edge of real discourse in terms of politics. The Idaho delegation stopped taking us seriously. The Idaho public stopped taking us seriously. And we really saw the movement atrophy. And it was really a lot of work in Idaho, started with a lot of great work led by grassroots people in the Owyhee Canyonlands. It was work on the Boulder White Clouds, again by a bunch of grassroots folks, a lot of them in this room, that started saying, we got to get back to naming it and saving it, as Brock Evans used to say. We have to create these movements, and we rebuilt the Idaho way of doing it. And again, we had a stunning success with the Owyhee, but the actual reality is we haven't had a success yet on the National Forests of Idaho. The Boulder White Clouds is a grand path. It's a grand endeavor that has not been finished.
Rick, would you give a public shout out to Senator Crapo for what he did on that? That was a lot of hands-on work, wasn't it, by him?
There's no question Senator Crapo deserves fantastic credit for the Owyhee effort, but what I would really give, and particularly with Craig, I'll let Craig respond to this, but what I would really give the credit to is the Owyhee Initiative people that sat around the table for 8 years, led by a member of that community, Fred Grant, and some of the other leaders, that actually brought a package to Mike Crapo. The key thing that Crapo did was he agreed he would carry that package forward. The other untold part of it is then the Democrats changed it quite a bit in Washington, D.C., but then it was carried forward. That was Craig's.
Yeah, I'd open this up to Doug, Craig, and Ralph, because what I heard you just describe was a bottoms-up approach rather than a top-down approach, and with a lot of people just rolling up their sleeves for a lot of years, just grinding it out, and very, very important. I think one of the reasons my bill failed is that I was a little top-down oriented, quite frankly, and you had county supervisors and ranchers and cattlemen on the ground, and agreeing on what was there and what needed to be protected. Craig, Doug?
Yeah, I just want to say that the story of the negotiation, as one means, the story of persistence, these are all vital. Senator Crapo deserves a huge shout out because he not only did the story that Rick just told, but he has been helpful with the proposed Scotchman Peaks Wilderness up on the Idaho Panhandle side, south of Sandpoint, and the adjacent area in northwestern Montana. I was with it at a meeting up there of the group that promotes that, and he gave a terrific speech. And I am told that not this year, but next, he believes he can move the rest of the delegation, which is no small moving. You take the earth and then you look for a lever. Larry, I think that you undersell yourself. It was a reminder to us all that the worm turns politically even in very difficult Western states. And it turned when Frank was defeated, and that was difficult. But then Senator Crapo stepped up. It'll turn again for Democrats in the House, and I'm not being partisan about this. Following you, Walt Minnick, another one-term member of the House, Democrat, a terrific guy. I remember Rick sitting at the Wild Idaho Year gathering every May up at Redfish Lake, and Walt and Mike Simpson sat there for seemed like an hour and a half. I wanted it to go on forever and be on CBS News as a required special for all you folks. It was an ode to bipartisanship in what everyone else would expect were impossible circumstances. And what it really was an ode to fighting cynicism. Sometimes I think that's the business I'm really in, because everything in our society, social media, kids, 24-hour minute news, Fox, are just constantly hammering away at the notion that our politicians are bought and sold, that one little citizen can't possibly make a difference. And this whole history just flatly demonstrates that that's, I was going to use another word, poppycock, Frank's word. And I wanted to say just, while I'm up to that, the Land and Water Conservation Fund does not need to be reauthorized. It only needs for the money to be reauthorized, and it will be, because everybody in Congress has a park and a forest and all that, local parks too, who get this money. And the money doesn't come out of your pocket. It comes from the revenues our government receives from the oil and gas, offshore oil and gas drilling, of which there is an endless supply. The Gulf Coast experience notwithstanding. So it will happen. I would be very surprised if it didn't happen in the lame duck session coming up shortly. The Blue Range Primitive Area, I'm just going to quick fix a couple of things. The Blue Range Primitive Area is the last one that has not been designated by Congress. It is protected by a provision of the Wilderness Act until Congress does otherwise with it. I have a friend who has an in-holding that he lives on down in the middle of it. It will be the last wilderness ever designated in Arizona, because everything else is more endangered to some degree or another, and so the Arizona groups are not going to go fiddling around with the Blue Range. Barry Goldwater fought the Wilderness Act. FDR was a great wilderness president. He went to Glacier Park and toured it. He did the CCC. He did his Secretary of the Interior did an astonishing thing. He tried to steal Tom's National Forest Service wholesale. When that didn't work, he's tried to steal it piecemeal by working to move over all the wilderness areas and make them national parks, and did a pretty good job with a couple of them. Global warming, all the things I talked about and Rick has talked about as lessons for political effectiveness. Learn them. They'll last you a lifetime, because you can take them and apply them exactly to global warming. And there is no worse challenge for our future. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. Craig, Ralph, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess so. As long as we're, I was going to say, as long as we're doing, I think, shout outs here, I want to make a couple points about the Owyhee effort. And A lot of credit goes in the Owahis to the county commissioners who were in Owyhee County at that time. It wasn't that they were wilderness champions by any means. It was just that they had seen, national park proposals come and go. They'd seen national conservation area proposal. They'd seen the national monument proposal, which was a near-death experience for them. And they had basically decided that something was going to happen in the Owahis sooner or later, and they wanted to be part of it rather than have it done to them. I think that gets to the point of kind of the bottom-up proposal. So they, you can imagine, county commissioners going back to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress with the Wilderness Society and with the Sierra Club walking the halls together makes an impact. I think we were late for every single congressional appointment because trying to get these guys with these giant belt buckles through the metal detectors always was a struggle. And so it was good that we weren't judged on our promptness because we were always late. And they can't walk very fast in cowboy boots, I found out very quickly. But once we got in the meeting, they were great. And I've got to make the point that those county commissioners and the sheriff and the ranchers, every time we asked them to do something, whether go to D.C. or go meet with Butch Otter, who, by the way, hated it, absolutely hated the fact that his people were in there with me talking about wilderness. He just despised that. But he also wasn't about to buck them at the end either. So it talks about delivering the constituency you need to deal with your politicians.
I think, let's see, use this yet.
They probably
How's
got
that?
it. Yeah.
Okay.
He's got it.
I think Rick Johnson had a really important point on what happened to the movement to establish more wilderness areas in Idaho, and then with the Owyhee Canyonlands finally being a breakout on that, it's because people have to know the place. And once Rare 1 and Rare 2 recommendations were made, and when omnibus wilderness bills began to be presented, there was not the enthusiasm for a place anymore. I mean, if you read something in the newspaper that conservationists are advocating 26 roadless areas for inclusion in the Wilderness Act versus talking about the majesty of the White Cloud Mountains or of the Lost River Range and the lakes and the cliffs and everything like that, what is going to motivate people? It's not going to be the 26 roadless areas. And so we always did well when we concentrated on 1 or 2 areas at a time. And this is almost intrinsic, really, politically, and I knew that. One of the things I did after the River of No Return Wilderness was set out to establish what became the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Now, there is a symbol for you, Yellowstone National Park, and all of the country around it, like the Tetons and the Targhee National Forest and Island Park. That was very easy. It was almost too easy. It attracted too much money almost, which has been the problem with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition since, in my opinion. But that shows the power of place, and that's something we always have to keep foremost in our minds.
Rick, did you have something?
Let's talk about the economics of wilderness a little bit. And you're on the front lines. Craig, you were out in Owyhee talking about, the future of the lands there, how they were going to get designated. Is there an argument for the economy with wilderness and how it helps the state, or is it just a lockup and we just need to do it? How do you argue that?
Well, I watched one of the Custer County Commissioners this fall basically throw Stanley under the bus when he mentioned that Frank Church Wilderness didn't bring anything into Custer County. You're never going to make the argument for some folks that wilderness is part of the economy. They are so focused on the rearview mirror, looking for the next big mine, the next big clear cut, the next big whatever, that you're never going to get folks to acknowledge that you don't have to take something from the land to make a buck from it. And that are the folks who are going to minimize themselves in these debates, because I think the larger part of Idaho gets that it's an important part of our economy. But it didn't really have an effect in Owyhee County. folks, it didn't seem to matter that this was a possibility. They weren't much into diversifying the economy. That's going to happen over time, whether the Wilderness Society is there or not. It's a tough argument, and I've not found it helps if people want to believe in wilderness and support it. I haven't seen it change many people's minds because it's just too many people yet focused on, well, we used to have a mill in McCall, we used to have a mill in Riggins, we used to have a big mill in Grangeville, and they're wishing for that to come back again until they get over this wish to return to the 1970s where it doesn't get a lot of traction.
I think one thing that has been most articulately stated by Cecil Anders years ago, but he talked about Idaho's second paycheck. That people live in Idaho for a lot of different reasons, and they stay in Idaho for a lot of different reasons, and it probably has something to do with their professional situation, the job they have, and the family they're raising. But part of the reason that they stay here, and part of the reason they hope their kids will stay here, and increasingly why their kids do stay here, is because of that second paycheck. And that second paycheck is when Friday afternoon rolls around, or your summer vacation rolls around, or your winter ski trip rolls around. You load up the car and you head out and you go spend time in the backcountry, you go spend time fishing, you teach your kids how to hunt. You have this, the Idaho Conservation League was founded 41 years ago to keep Idaho, Idaho. And I've spoken so many groups, and when I say the word Idaho, and you talk about what does that mean to you, it's the second paycheck. What the word Idaho means is the majesty of the mountains, the clarity of the water, the look of a sunset. So I think that's a big part of the economic argument. There also is some proven actual economic data, and the biggest contribution that wilderness and protected landscapes make has been demonstrated by an organization called Headwaters Economics. And the work that they have done is demonstrate that communities that are close to protected areas benefit not just from the obvious businesses of outfitting and service providers, but the enduring benefit is when you have entrepreneurial growth. People want to move, people want to retire, people want to, get a second home, what have you. Come in, and oftentimes it is the most clean energy you can have because they're people bringing their own incomes with them because they're retired or they're doing bringing internet-based activity into the community. And the single greatest catalyst for that is if there's an airstrip or an airport in proximity to that. But Headwaters, I encourage people that want to explore the economic tie to protected lands, check out the Headwaters website. It's really, really good.
And the way to do that is to go to their website. It's a free tool. You download it, you put the county you're interested in, and bang, you've got a report that is undeniable data pulled from all the best and most current data, beautiful pie charts and pictures. And the other thing about the airport, it has to have commercial service.
Right.
One of the important things to understand is while economic arguments are very important, especially because they seem to have an air of objectivity, which other arguments don't, that a lot of the opposition to wilderness and other conservation measures for the land are culturally based, and they don't really respond to economic arguments. They'll try to use economic arguments too, just like we will. But there is a culture in parts of Idaho and many other states which says that land which is not being altered by human activity is land which is somehow being wasted. In fact, it's being wasted even if you lose money in doing the altering. I mean, if you end up with less money after you've cut the timber than before, nevertheless, it's a good thing that those trees don't rot in the forest. And that is, I think, the most difficult thing to get around and when it comes to these measures. And we still haven't figured out a way to get around that very well. And maybe we're even getting worse at it as kind of a backward-looking ideology spreads around the nation.
I remember on the Gospel Hump issue that it was really economics that brought the wilderness together because the Chamber of Commerce in Grangeville wanted to have certainty on what was going into wilderness and what would be allowed for multiple use. And that's what when Senator Church was asked to mediate and bring the various factions together to come up with a solution and a proposal. Out of that came the Gospel Hump Wilderness, and then certain areas were then set aside for multiple use. And but this gets into the esoteric parts of designing this legislation, right, Doug, on release language and water rights, and these are where the real fights are done on the language, and every word means something. We had considerable interest when the chief was presenting from questioners and from the audience. We've got about 15 minutes left. We could extend that a little bit, but I think Gary invited people to go back to the microphones if you had a question. But speaking of Gary, do you have a question for this great panel? You've been on the front lines as well for many years, and we thank you.
Yeah, my question is about Congressman Simpson's latest gambit, which when I read about it in the Statesman the other day, I thought, well, this is brilliant. Obviously, he's going to put a lot of pressure on the delegation to go with his proposal rather than have the president declare a monument. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the political implications with the delegation, but also whether that's going to turn around the people in Custer County to see a better benefit from his proposal than having the president sign a.
Okay, and that question's for the panel at large, right,
Yeah.
Gary? Okay.
I'll start with that. This little stack of 12 years of Mike Simpson's legislation in Congress is a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous tribute to the evolution of Mike Simpson as a member of Congress. He's become a close friend, a close collaborator. We have worked really hard, many of us, to try to move that bill forward. How many people here actually think Congress is going to pass a bill on anything? I don't think these guys can order lunch. So it's the prospects, you know, I think that we have to be realistic about this. The reason it's being talked about now to the degree it is because we have the pressure of a presidential monument designation. It is a catalyst for creative thought. That is a great thing. And I appreciate the creative thought. But I also recognize that I shouldn't be cynical about Congress because that is how we get things done. But at the same time, and I wake up every morning as a crazed optimist. You can't have this kind of job and not be an optimist sort of insufferably. That said, I am not optimistic about the U.S. Congress. I'm not optimistic about the Idaho senators. This bill would have passed in the past if it wasn't for the Idaho senators. So it's, I think that Mr. Simpson is absolutely sincere in his intent to move this forward, and he might have a shot. But I also think others might use it as a delaying tactic to run out the clock and let the Obama administration end without getting it done. And as I suspect Cecil Anders might talk about tonight, in Alaska, he designated many monuments to ensure something got done, and then Congress came to the table and authorized some of those to create wilderness areas, parks, and other protected areas. So I think the monument option is absolutely critical, and I think the administration should move forward in due haste.
Anybody else?
Congress is, unfortunately, perhaps a dead institution. It's never passed so few bills, except in the very beginning, perhaps in the time of George Washington. They don't work.
Larry, let me just add that I'm utterly optimistic. Harry Reid, the majority leader who is a master of the Senate, has a large bill for BLM land in his own state that he wants, more next year. Lamar Alexander, the number 4 leader in the House, has a 25,000-acre bill in the Cherokee National Forest in East Tennessee that he wants badly. And we want him to want it badly and get it done because waiting in the wings is 350,000 plus acres in the long hanging fire wilderness proposal for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And Senator Alexander is retiring in in 16. Mike Simpson is respected, deeply respected. Harry Reid and Mike Simpson have bonded. They bonded over the efforts last time. And Harry Reid has gathered all these bills up. One passed in March in Michigan, the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And it was sponsored by two of the most liberal senators in the Senate and a way left of Tea Party member in the House. And he was, interestingly, he was very candid. He said, I needed to green up for the election. Great.
So the one point that Congressman Simpson mentioned in the Statesman story was that the chairmanship of the House Natural Resources Committee is going to be under new leadership, and that'll be Rob Bishop from Utah. And Congressman Simpson's analysis was that they work together and that there would be more affinity there. If Mike Simpson comes back and gives this bill a low number, and that is introduces it on January 4th, like Senate Bill number 4, like Senator Church did when he introduced the bill, then it could have some momentum and get on the calendar and move forward, perhaps. I'm trying to give a bit of a optimistic view of this, and he is a tenacious legislator. So let's go to your question, though, and speak loudly.
Let me just say something about what I think will happen. I don't doubt the sincerity of Congressman Simpson, but let's assume they get a good, clean bill and it starts to make its way through Congress. The way Congress has acted for about the last 8 years, I suppose, is it will be attached to some other piece of legislation,
Yes.
and there'll be some aspect of that other piece of legislation which will be found odious by either the Republicans or the Democrats, and it will die because of it. Or if it does go through, we'll probably feel very badly about what it was attached to.
He's smarter than that. He'll pass it, he'll hook it to the continuing resolution. Must pass legislation. That's what he did in 2009.
So the issue will be in the Senate, and if the senators feel the heat, then something might happen. But people have to act to feel the heat. So let's go to your question.
So all the panelists have talked about like Rare 1, Rare 2, and these roadless areas. How do you propose that we balance growing demand for development from a growing population with these conservation and, preventing people from building houses or building roads that makes things easier for them?
Okay, panel?
I'll jump in on that. Rare 1 and Rare 2, I filed the appeals on both of them, and we won the lawsuits that ensued, which required the Forest Service to go back and attempt to figure out a resolution. That Rare 2 legal decision is what led to the requirement that in forest plans, which heretofore had been a kind of a 3-minute exercise, slight exaggeration, with no NEPA compliance, would be fully NEPA compliant forest plans with a mandatory, this is the so-called release language, applies here. No, it doesn't. But the Forest Service has adopted it here and in Montana, the two states that didn't pass a bill in the 80s. And every acre of those areas is protected by statute. And if there are additional acres, which there are, that go beyond on federal land under any jurisdiction, and Rick's group and Craig's group and so forth are advocating that, they have the tools. And the agencies now are very good. The Forest Service is very good about saying, oh, we respect that you have a proposal and we'll keep it on ice. And the only opposition is the miners and the gougers and the, and not even them, the oil drillers, the frackers, and the lunatic wing of the off-road vehicle movement.
I think that getting to that question too is when we come up with packages that lead to permanent protection, they're often involved in a conversation with other stakeholders that are also looking for something for their community or whether they're, their broader landscape. We have a conversation that Senator Crapo is very involved in and all our organizations in the Clearwater right now, the Clearwater Basin Collaborative. And it's been a multi-year process where we've been putting together wilderness designations, which would be the first designations north of Highway 12 in Idaho, be a real positive thing. But we also, to make that happen, are going to have to ensure that the other activities proposed for national forests, particularly on the roaded landscape, There's a lot of country that has been roaded, that has been developed, that could be sustainably managed for the timber industry, for fire issues, for restoration forestry, for restoration of white pine. And we have to, as the conservation community, have to make sure that the Forest Service processes work for everybody. One of the challenges is Congress can designate wilderness and it's instant. It happens right then. But some of the other compromises that are part of these bills are more of an administrative process, and it's easier for those to get gummed up. And I think as conservationists, we have to engage those in good faith and help all the stakeholders, as we are doing in the Oahe, make sure all the stakeholders get what they signed up for too.
After Rare 2 was hung up, the upshot was a bill that I was involved in called the Endangered American Wilderness Act. Its lead sponsor in the Senate, to get back to the subject at hand, was Senator Frank Church. I had the pleasure, it had the Gospel Hump Wilderness. That's where that came from. I had the pleasure of standing behind Senator Church when, in the cabinet room, when President Carter came in and signed that into law, and so 240,000 acres in round numbers went into the wilderness system that day.
So, let's go to your question.
It has been reiterated among this morning's several speakers that the public's interest in these matters is what moves preservation forward, that the representation we have will continue to work towards these shared ideas of preservation. While attending high school, I've had the opportunity of seeing my generations and generations following mine establishing a higher sense of apathy towards these growing wilderness preservation efforts. What specific actions do you plan to take to establish a greater sense of importance of these parks to our nation's youth and young adults? And how do you plan to educate more people on the impact our presence has on the environment?
Okay. Panel?
How are we going to educate people? Okay, sorry.
I think that I think Ralph touched on part of that here, is that one of the things that groups like mine need to do is to make sure the discussions are not done in the abstract and to get people out on the ground. I lost track of the number of times the Sierra Club did their Owyhee County Roundup, with the specific example of taking people from the Treasure Valley out to Owyhee County to introduce them to Canyonlands. I don't know how many hikes have been done in the White Clouds, and that may seem like a drop in the bucket, but it's not actually. As you provide opportunities to show people the landscape, in my opinion, is they're more than halfway there to wanting to help protect it. We used to do hikes in the Oahes, guided hikes. It was kind of a slapdash effort in the spring or the fall. They booked up incredibly quickly. And so people want to go see these places, particularly from the Treasure Valley here, people who've moved here. So I think it's kind of incumbent upon, conservation groups and other outdoor groups to organize ways to show people the land, because that's what makes the difference. Do we have a big scheme for it? No. Too often we use it as a tool for a bigger package or a bigger goal, like a wilderness bill. But the concern about getting kids out or the younger generation out, no easy answers for that one, because you look at people generally, what they say, it took how many years to get the 5-day work week, and it took a cell phone a few months to destroy it. I think society in all is too plugged in and too hooked on immediate things on a screen here. And hopefully it's a passing thing, or will we get a better balance here in the coming years? But it's not a good answer for it right now.
I think another piece for this is stewardship. Chief Tidwell talked about how the budgets no longer exist to take care of these incredible national treasures that we have. I want to make a plug for the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation that has a great program of collecting internships, bringing people out, and they spend the summer rebuilding bridges, putting in trails, and getting to know the country with their with other kids. And I just had a really fun experience where one of the former interns from a couple years ago said, yeah, I met you. You know, we came into your office and you talked about wilderness and you talked about conservation. And and he just spent a year working for the Forest Service on the Sawtooth, and now he's bugging me for a job. And that is cool. That's how it happens. You get people outside, they learn to love the place. They also get blisters on their hands and they get some laughs with their friends, and it becomes part of their life the way it became when I first started my remarks, it starts because of the place. It doesn't start because you like politics. It doesn't start because you think that it's fun to lobby Congress, because frankly that's a little overrated. It starts because you love a place. Yes.
Tom, could you come up and just talk about your program for kids?
Doug, did you?
Well,
let's see, you had a question. Yes.
You're all obviously conservationists and you're all for the conservation of wilderness, but there's obviously another side to the same coin. What do you think the most compelling anti-conservation argument is?
Okay.
Because it's just fine the way it is. And I think that is also the most compelling argument for conservation. We commonly have events where someone will say, it's just fine the way it is. You wouldn't be here talking about wanting to protect it if it wasn't great now. And I understand the logic. But in a time of growing population, changes in recreation, you can buy, for $100,000, you can buy a jetpack now. Let alone the changes that are happening in motorized recreation, all these things. We cannot now foresee what it will be like 20, 30, 40 years from now. Because it's great now is why we need to protect it now. But that's the argument I most hear. It's fine the way it is. That's the point. It is fine the way it is. Let's do something about it.
Howard Zahniser was a genius. The Wilderness Act precludes, amongst other things, any other form of mechanized transport. That's why mountain bikes are not allowed in wilderness. Now, what that says to us is we need to sit down with the mountain biking community and work out reasonable compromises so that they have good areas. We need to do the same thing with the off-road vehicle people. That's happening all over the country, and it's working just fine, and everybody comes out a winner.
Ralph, Craig? Okay. The microphones are empty. I assume that there are no more questions. There is a question. Last one.
Thanks. I don't think I'm supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I want to thank
Should we get security? Or,
No, no.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, I'm no threat. I want to thank every one of you for the great contributions you've made to keeping Idaho special and preserving the things that make it a special place. And the future generations will never be able to repay you guys for all that you've done for us.
Well, as I mentioned, thank you very much. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this panel, there's well over 100 years of activism sitting up on this stage today of people that have preserved the best of Idaho and are still working at it. And I got a note here, which was a good note from a colleague of mine, and suggested that I urge the students and women in the audience to do some research on Bethene Church and to talk about her life. Remember, she was the one who wagged her finger in Rick Johnson's face when he went to her to ask for counsel, and she said, "What took you so long?" I mean, this woman, when you research her life and find out what a force she was as a partner with Senator Church, you'll be absolutely amazed at what she did to really move the conservation ethic and movement along. And I remember a time when we were sitting around in a motel room and meeting with Dennis Baird and Mort Brigham, looking at the maps on a bed, and everybody was on their knees looking at the maps, and there was Bethine with Senator Church talking about areas and what he should do and the guts that he needed to do, and she was comforting him about taking this on, increasing the wilderness area that he was going to take to the floor of the Senate and saying this is the right thing to do. And because she had the people that Rick talked about, the special people who knew the special places, but she was there encouraging Senator Church to do the right thing and risk the consequences that come about through politics, because only politics can do it. I thought we had a great panel today. I think this is a great conference. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you later.
And Brock is doing really well.